an article, but a chapter in his book, Faith and Certitude. Okay. Does anyone not have a copy of this? We'll have to do it. Right.
I got a book. I read from the book.
You read from the book?
Yeah. I'll share with Craig.
Okay, I have
Do you have extras?
I have one extra copy here. Someone must not have gotten it.
Mike wants the extra copy.
Yeah, obviously.
Pardon me?
Maybe doesn't have it. I can share with Craig. Or
I
I'll
mean, it's
share with
easier
him.
for us to share since we're right next to each other. It's better for them.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Cool.
You turn to page 92 and 93. Okay? 92 and 93. I'm just going to review this quickly with his reasons for what he says on the bottom of page 92, an unconscious motivation for people just sticking to an argument irrationally. Okay? Well, because I believe this, or I feel that this is the right answer without really thinking through why someone would hold to a position that is not rational. This past Saturday, there appeared in the paper a little article which shows, I think, demonstrates how people tend to think irrationally. The school board of Janesville, Wisconsin, they passed a resolution which allows so-called transgendered students, if a male or female thinks he or she has, he has feminine feelings or she has male feelings, to use bathrooms and locker rooms of the opposite sex. So they're allowing this. This is part of a whole national, you could say international movement to what I think is to break down the moral fiber of society. And I don't believe it's rational if someone felt like a male is really a female. Well, they should go to counseling, because counselors can help people redirect their thinking in the right manner. But actually, the gay agenda has trumped that also, because there are laws in a number of states, California, Colorado, Massachusetts as well, maybe it's New Jersey, yeah, which prohibits counselors from counseling someone out of a same-sex attraction to an opposite-sex attraction. Even if they want it, they're prohibited from doing this. This is how strong the gay agenda is.
But isn't that why? Because some of them who actually went to counseling and then they started committing suicide?
No, that's what they're putting out there. Okay, and in fact, that's why they say you can't criticize us, because you may make us feel bad, and someone may want to take their life. Well, we should try to help people in this situation, because you can redirect their attraction, especially when they're young.
How?
Through counseling, to show people why you have a same-sex attraction. Many good doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists have been successful in this for 25 years. I know them personally. And they had great success with this, to redirect someone's sexual attraction. So anyway, I don't want to get off on that point today. I'm just saying that my point is that some people think irrationally. I don't think the school board decision is a rational decision. I don't think would you girls want guys walking into your bathrooms and locker rooms? I don't think so. I just think it's not a good idea. I think most people would think this is out of touch with reality, objective reality. Anyway, Father Dubay offers a number of reasons why people may not think rationally. And One is on the top of page 93, the lack of serious thinking and study. It's difficult to get people to study. It's not easy. People want easy slogans. And it's much easier just to go along with a slogan, a popular slogan, than to study an issue, think it through, and be able to articulate a position. It takes mental work, and people are not willing to do that oftentimes. It's a laborious task, as he says here. It requires study, research, checking, evaluating, concluding, testing, and he talks in the last paragraph how many discussions about the church or functions are little more than exchanges of emotion. I know this because I deal with this with people. They're just speaking emotionally. They're not thinking things through and articulating their positions rationally. Well, I just feel this way. That's all they say. Well, can you tell me why? And they can't. And then they refuse to try to articulate a position. Anyway, it's easy to live by slogans, and just turn to page 95, because in the middle of the page there, about halfway down, he says, people hold whatever they hold either because of, this is generally speaking, either because of some authority, ecclesial, church, or dissenting, or because of their own preference and feelings. But this is not thinking. Now, in regard to authority, yes, the church teaches, God reveals things, we should obey the church, but the church wants us to think things through and be able to articulate reasons for our belief. God has revealed to us there are three persons in one God. We, in the church, have tried to explain that through theology. What does it mean that there are three persons in one God? How can there be three persons in one God? Theology has worked to explain this, to give a reason for this. This is not unreasonable to say that there are three persons in one God, even though Richard Dawkins, the so-called great microbiologist, I forget, he's an evolutionist, speaks of people who believe that God is delusional. Well, that's just using a slogan, and that's not articulating a position. Actually, his positions are pretty weak if you read him. They're not deeply thought out. We can refute them. And so we shouldn't just, you want to obey the church's teaching, but you want to be able to give a reason for the church's teaching. That's what theology does. And he goes on to say, but this is not thinking. Acceptance of a divinely authorized teaching authority frees one from the need to reason one's way through to a conclusion. Rejecting such an authority logically leads to a practical skepticism. We don't want to just reject authority and say, well, I don't believe any authority. No, but we don't want to take the other side and just say, well, I just believe it because the church teaches it. If someone wants to do that, okay, but we want people to go beyond that and to be able to explain their position. The church has teachings, and the church is able to explain positions on its teachings. And they're beautiful, they make sense, they're rational arguments. And so that's his point here. Two, the second big reason why people just hold irrationally to a position, love of fashion rather than the truth. I'm relevant, I want to be in. I know people like this. They just whatever the majority is thinking, they'll think the same way and mouth their positions without thinking things through. And on the next page, 96, the first full paragraph there, he says, truth, of course, is always relevant in the good sense because being in touch with reality is relevant. The problem is that we sin-wounded humans often do not know what is good for us. God's ways are not our ways. We're also great conformists. People, perhaps the most rigid conformists, are the very people who think of themselves as at the cutting edge of the future. I know people like this. Well, I'm really at the cutting edge because a few people are thinking this way, and here's where we're going, like allowing the boys into the girls' bathrooms and locker rooms. Well, this isn't really a well thought out position, and if you think you're really being on the cutting edge because you're promoting this, well, you may think what you will, but it's not a well thought out rational position. Love for fashion rather than the truth constantly leads people into error. It's fashionable to be where the crowd is, to be where most people are. I said in my homily yesterday at Mass, college students tell me, especially some high school students at the public high schools, if they voice any opinion, for example, that two people of the same sex should not be allowed to marry, they're thought of as Nazis. How dare you say something like this? And someone has to be strong to go against the grain when everyone's going one way, to say no. This is not a rational, thought-out position. We don't redefine marriage to suit our own tastes. Because why not have one person marrying 5 people or 10 people? Anyway, number 3, page 97, the darkening effect of moral guilt. Sin clouds perception. It really does. I'll give an example of this. I've heard former abortionists talk. I met one of the leaders the founders of NARAD, the National Abortion Rights Action League, Dr. Bernard Nathanson. He was Jewish. He's passed away. He converted to Catholicism, and he reasoned his way to the truth about unborn life. He said, I realized studying fetology, the development of the unborn child, that I'm committing murder here. He made the movie The Silent Scream, if you've ever heard of it. When the ultrasound first came out, and they were showing doctors how to perform abortions. That's why they were using it. Here you go in and you pull the child, you rip the arms apart, you rip the legs apart, and when the instrument went into the child was going back and opening its mouth. And Dr. Nathanson saw this. He said, well, this child who was well developed, like 8 months old, looks like it's screaming. So he made this movie, The Silent Scream. He stopped doing abortions. But he and others, former abortionists, cited a number of them. They said when they did their first abortion, they couldn't sleep the night before. Afterwards, some of them said they threw up, because they were so upset. But after they did their 1,000th or 5,000th or 10,000th abortion, their conscience was deadened, and they thought nothing of it. This is going to work. I mean, just normal work. Okay? This is how sin can cloud the intellect. Okay? We make excuses. We rationalize things. So sin is a grace blocker and an intellect blocker. We don't think correctly if we're immersed in sin. And it's part of the reason, as he says here, our sex-saturated society, and people can't see the purpose of human sexuality if they're immersed in sexual sins. And much of our society, that's the case. The next page, 98, about the second from the last paragraph. Why does any sin darken the mind to ultimate truth? Well, I think this was one of those questions you answered. We reach reality as a whole person, not a detached intellect. And he goes on to say here, few people leave the church for intellectual reasons. The main reasons are moral. You don't have people arguing over whether stealing is right or wrong, the 7th Commandment, or I was going to say the fifth commandment, but abortion is an exception because abortion is related to sexuality. We have abortion because it's the backup to failed contraception. The Supreme Court says this, they've said this. We need abortion to back up failed contraception. So that's not really an intellectual reason. Another good example of this where people hold their positions because of their sinful conduct, he mentions Henry VIII on page 99. Henry VIII, he was awarded a medal or some type of a certificate by the Pope as being a great defender of the faith. He wrote a book, The Defense of the Faith and the Sacraments, against Martin Luther, because Martin Luther had come out against the sacraments, saying that the Eucharist was just was not. There isn't a transubstantiation that takes place, the change of substance of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus. That doesn't happen. And Henry VIII wrote a book refuting Luther and other Protestants, and the Pope awarded him the title, the Great Defender of the Faith. But then he said, well, the Pope isn't head of the Church in England. I am, as king. Now, why did he say that? You know why?
You didn't agree with it?
No. Why did he say this, though? Why did he say the Pope isn't head of the Church in England? I am. And he made everyone in England, especially the people in power, swear an oath of fidelity to him as being head of the church. And Thomas More, St. Thomas More, wouldn't sign the oath, wouldn't take the oath. He wouldn't say why, because he was a great lawyer. If he didn't say why, then they couldn't convict him, okay, of treason. Richard Rich perjured himself at his trial and said he heard him say because he didn't agree that Henry VIII was the head of the church. No, Thomas More never said his reason why he wouldn't take the oath. Richard Rich perjured himself, and the jury found him guilty, and he was beheaded. His last words, does anyone know his last words? Famous last words of Thomas More. I die the king's good servant, but God's first. So I've been the king's good servant, but I'm God's first. And A Man for All Seasons, Robert Bolt's play. Robert Bolt, who was an atheist, by the way, but he was so impressed by Thomas More, his moral integrity, that he wrote this play. Anyway, back to Henry VIII. So what was the reason he declares himself, rather than the Pope, as head of the church? The excuse he gave was, as it says here, we claim to see through the pretensions of the papacy. Oh, the papacy, they're just claiming these powers. Okay, all of a sudden he comes up with this argument. Well, there's a reason behind this. You know what the reason was? It was a moral reason. It clouded his intellect. It caused him to declare himself the King of England rather than the Pope as head of the Church in England. That's why the Anglican Church is called the Church of England, because the king or the queen is head of the church. But there was a moral reason why Henry VIII did this. You know what the reason is? You know who his wife was? His true wife was Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And she had a daughter only. Henry wanted a son. And he had a couple children die. Well, he began to place his vision toward other women. One in particular. Does anyone know who it is? The name of the woman? Do you know her?
I haven't learned this in Europe for 2 years.
Yeah.
He had like 6 wives.
Well, he went through them one after another, yes, but the first one that resulted in breaking away from the church was Anne Boleyn.
Oh,
She was a young, pretty gal. Actually, here's another. This is from Protestant sources. Actually, there is evidence that Anne Boleyn was Henry VIII's daughter. That he had an affair with Anne Boleyn's mother, and this is how distorted this relationship was. Anyway, Henry VIII wants a divorce. Actually, he wanted an annulment, the Pope to declare his marriage to Catherine of Aragon a nullity. Because Catherine of Aragon had been married to Henry's brother, who was the king. They never consummated the marriage. Because they were married when they were very young, and his brother died. And Henry VIII, after he gets into an affair with Anne Boleyn, says, oh, well, my marriage, I'm really feeling guilty about this because this was not a true marriage because I married my father's brother. Scripture prohibits this. Well, it didn't. And the Pope said, no, there's no grounds for an annulment here. So Henry VIII then declares himself as head of the Church in England, and he gets his right-hand man, Cardinal Wolsey and others to grant him an annulment from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and he, quote, marries Anne Boleyn. And there's a great scene in the play, and this was from real life. He's at the wedding party with Anne Boleyn, and he thinks that, see, Thomas More won't go along with this. Thomas More won't sign the act of supremacy or attest to it, that Henry's the head of the church. And Henry is after his wedding to Anne Boleyn, the wedding party. He thinks he sees Thomas More in the crowd, and he's really excited. Why? Because he thinks, oh, Thomas More finally agreed to go along with me. He runs up and turns this fellow around. Well, it's not Thomas More. It was his conscience was bothering him. And it bothered him so much that he couldn't stand to have Thomas More around. He was in the Tower of London for quite a while. Finally, they had a mock trial. Richard Rich perjured himself, and they found him guilty, and they cut off his head. Henry VIII went through a number of women then. Okay? He really, because his intellect was clouded, okay, he just started killing wives, one after another. Okay? Boom, boom, boom. You were a wife of Henry VIII. You were not long for the world. Okay? But Catherine of Aragon he never touched. She went off and lived, finished her life, and all the people of England knew that Catherine was a true queen, and that her daughter was the real queen, the successor. That Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne. Anyway, Henry VIII is a good example of how people make excuses for their positions when you scratch under the surface and there's a moral reason for this. And I'll recommend a book here, E. Michael Jones, Dr. E. Michael Jones, whom I know. He publishes a magazine called Culture Wars. Talks about what's going on in our culture. And he wrote a book called Degenerate Moderns, about how many big movers and shakers in our society, in art, in anthropology, in psychology, their theories were not good theories. For example, Freud and Jung, okay, they put forward some theories. Who's another one that he names in his book? Margaret Mead, who discovered that gave some excuse in her research as an anthropologist for homosexual behavior. Well, it turns out that she had same-sex attraction. Okay, he looked at the personal life of Picasso. Picasso began, when he was an artist, very beautiful paintings, and then he went into this cubism and kind of ugly art, which was the rage, and people accepted it. Well, Michael Jones looked into Picasso's personal life, and he went through women, quite a few women, wasn't living morally. And E. Michael Jones's point of his book is that people's philosophies or art or whatever, it's often a reflection when you see something that isn't right of their own immoral behavior. And it's a good study in human psychology, the people he studies, because that's the conclusion he reaches. Again, sin clouding the truth and resulting in perversion. We turn to page 100. Well, number 4, following preferences rather than evidence. People like the proposition. Okay, wishful thinking, source of deception. Okay, Well, we want to not just hold to a position because we like it. We have to think. That's what a good education is about. We want to be able to think and articulate positions. Not just say, I hold to this position. Well, why? Well, because I do. Well, that's not good enough. Popes in recent decades have called us to a new evangelization. Have you heard of that? Anyone heard of it? The new evangelization. You know what that means? New evangelization. What does that mean, Andrew? What do you think?
It means going out and spreading the faith to others.
Why is it called the new evangelization instead of the old? Isn't this old? Didn't Jesus call us to evangelization? Why is it called new evangelization? The popes have told us. Do you know why?
Because we have to have knowledge to back up what we preach.
Well, that's part of it. We should be knowledgeable in our faith, be able to explain and defend it, but it's called new evangelization because of a couple of reasons. One of them is there are still a lot of people out there who do not know Christ. Secondly, there are a lot of people out there who did know him and have abandoned him. When your generation, from 18 to 29, I think right now the figures show that about 35 to 40% of people between 18 and 29 have no religious affiliation at all. Nothing. They're not affiliated with any religion. They may believe in God, who knows, but they have no affiliation with religion, and these people are ripe for the picking out there. You run into them in college campuses and in everyday life, okay? We want to convince them we have the fullness of the truth. And to do that, we have to know our faith and be able to articulate it, okay? And someone, may read something in the paper, well, the Catholic Church holds this, why? They're just mean. Well, no, we have a reason for holding this position. This is why, to be able to explain it, articulate it. Now, you have a question? Never mind. No? Angel, you have a question?
No.
Comment? A thought you want to share? No?
No.
Okay.
We're done.
Tell you what.
You want to work today?
Well, hold it. What I want you to do for tomorrow, okay? I passed out this last week. Okay?
Alright.
Well,
The
that's
sheet,
what
the
there's-
Enlightenment, okay? Philosophers, and I'm just going to say the Enlightenment. This is a term used to describe a movement of philosophers. This was in the 17th and 18th centuries. At the time our country was being conceived, okay? And these philosophers and writers claimed that man had now come of age out of his infancy. How? By using reason, rather than depending upon the revelation of God to discover truths about man and the world. Okay? We're in the scientific age now. That was part of this. Okay, science was being scientific method. Okay, so now we have to reason to things, not rely on God, not rely on revelation. We can come to the truth of things without God. Well, that's not what the church teaches. The church wants us to use our reason, but not to abandon revelation. And there are a number of terms. I want you to read this over. Maybe I'll quiz you tomorrow on this, okay? Just to see if you
Why?
read it over. Why? Because I want you to read it to make sure you read it, okay? So read it over tonight. Rationalism, skepticism, empiricism, okay? And moral relativism. And then the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the biggies, okay? Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Voltaire, okay? These are names you should be familiar with because they influenced the founders of our country in a big way. These were well-read people. Everyone who was an intellectual was reading these people back a couple of hundred years ago when our nation was founded. And what I do here is to show the errors of their thinking. We have to know their errors. We can accept what's good in their thinking, but we have to be able to point out where they went off. as the Enlightenment philosophers. So read it. We'll discuss it tomorrow. Okay?